My name is Dr. Sarah Vinson, and this talk is about structural racism and Black child health. Of course, we have to share the introduction and disclosures. And I'm at Morehouse School of Medicine, where I'm an associate professor of psychiatry and pediatrics, the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellowship Program Director, and the medical advisor for the African American Behavioral Health Center of Excellence. I'm also the owner and founder of Lario Psych Group and Lario Forensics. And this is a quotation from someone that I met through the course of doing a forensic psychiatric evaluation, who was an adult at the time, but my role was as a child expert, and his story was one that was representative of the ways that structural trauma shapes the lives of developing people. And so in thinking about the state of Black America and of Black children in America, we have to take a historical lens. We have to put these things in context. Otherwise, we can be at risk of attributing some of the things that we're going to talk about in this discussion to individual traits. It's important that we take a broader structural lens that's also informed by how we got here. And so this is where it started, and the asterisk is for in the US, because of course this is something that has international implications as well. But we're going to take a look at the way that many people of African descent came to this country.
Well, you have to remember that we live under a tremendous weight of slavery now. And this isn't Black history we're talking about. This is our national history. It's my history. It's your history. People have been lynched, slaves. You went to the army and wasn't respected. You had to sit in the back of a bus. You need federal legislation to get you into a school to get an education. All of these things. So when you see Robert E. Lee on a column 80 feet tall, the man who wanted to retain slavery, it offends you. You've got two sides, and Blacks are screaming prejudice to the white side. And the white side is looking and saying, why don't they get over it? Why can't they get over it? And the Blacks don't understand that the whites don't know what the it is, what the IT is. We're trying somehow here to define the it. And unless you know what the it is, don't ask the question, why can't they get over it?
Parce qu'il a été vendu pour $175. Il a été aussi d'origine africaine, Little Jim. C'est comme ça qu'il a été fait. Ça, c'est la transcription française. 50 ans. African, il a été vendu à Etienne Villeray. Free colored man. Etienne, you need something?
Be sure that they toll that bell once for the slave, wherever there's a bell.
Okay, okay.
Notice I can't read right. When I was brought up, if my boss man catch me with a pencil or paper, it was 25 lashes. John McDonald. Over the last 16 years, we have been working on the Whitney Plantation. This plantation was built in 1790. The plantation was settled by Ambrose Heidel, and this property was available for sale. And for the first year, I just wrapped everything in plastic because it was only a real estate investment for me. But it was very shocking to me that I did not know about slavery. And I knew slaves were here, of course. I had no idea what a commodity they were and how they were treated as a commodity. I had no idea of how deprived they were, not by force of circumstance, but by deliberate planning.
Like the sheriff of the parish or the head of the militia would have something like this. to lock up runaway slaves until the master comes and claim them and pay the fees for feeding and watering, you know. They always refer to those slaves as animals. And even the runaway slaves, you know, they use the name Maroon. Maroon is from Cimarron, and Cimarrones are wild pig, you know. And this was part of slave control. My name is Ibrahim Asek. I met John Cummings in 2000, and he decided to hire me to be the director of research of this project. The fact of going into the archives and digging all those names and taking them back to life, everybody who comes here would know that Abdou from Senegal was a slave here. He died in 1836. You don't just teach slavery. These people have backgrounds. They came from Africa. But also you have to know that these people came maybe naked or half naked, but they didn't need a suitcase to put the culture inside. When you say blues, jazz, rock and roll, Zydeco, they know it all over the country and they like it. You know? It is rooted into slavery. People need to understand what happened on these plantations. It is not just a way of putting the guilt on someone. No, we don't need that. We need to understand today why we have so many problems in America, why so many people are in jail, why so much poverty, Black people being shot and killed like game. All that was rooted in slavery. And if you don't understand the source of the problem, how can we solve it?
What people have to realize, it was a bunch of people like me who started this mess. And they started slavery, and they dealt in slaves. And so why would it be a surprise if some white kid came along as a cheerleader and was trying to do something that would correct what his ancestors did? So I thought that I personally would no longer be satisfied living in ignorance, and also that I would try my best to present the facts of slavery to all of the people I could find, so that everyone would understand how strong the deck was stacked against the Africans here.
So one of the things that I want to pull out from that video, and there are a number of them, and I would encourage you that if you find yourself in Louisiana, that you take a trip to the Whitney Plantation. But his comment about the fact that this was deliberate planning. And there are ways that we continue to see that systems are planned in a way where the outcome is quite clear that it's going to be inequitable for Black children. One of the parts of the plantation which didn't make it to the video is a tribute to the children who died while they were in this system with their parents as enslaved people. And the point is that these children died not because they needed to, or because they had some genetic hardwired illness that was because of being Black, that they died because of the conditions that they were forced to live in, and the malnutrition and the things that they suffered as a result of them. And so this was a system that didn't protect children, that didn't protect people, and that treated people as commodities, as he mentioned, and was one where people were used for profit. And this was a race-based caste system seen in every US territory, but with more demand in the South. And as we're thinking about Black children and their place in American society, the fact that this was race-based is really, really important, that this was the marker that was used to let folks know that this is someone who is treated differently, and we continue to see ramifications of that. There's often discussion about the slave trade from Africa to the US. There's less about the domestic slave trade. And the reason that I want to be sure to point this out is because of what this meant for families. in Shirley Chisholm's book, she talks about the trauma that Black American descendant of slaves experienced, and it being something that was somewhat distinct from what was experienced in many Caribbean countries, even though they had slavery, because of this second Middle Passage, where you had families who were ripped apart, shipped across the country or to different regions of the country at a time where they had no rights to freely move or access transportation to do so. And the ongoing ramifications of families that are pulled apart in that way and disrupted in that way. And what we saw in this country is that even though less than 5% of Africans brought to the Americas are brought to the US, there was, again, this system of essentially breeding human beings and then disrupting those family ties because they were treated as commodities and taken around the country. But there is a way that the national narrative sometimes really focuses on the South, which isn't quite accurate, because this part of the economy certainly wasn't limited regionally. It was something that had great implications for the United States as a whole. And what you saw is that by 1822, half of New York City's exports were related to cotton, which was an industry that was really reliant on enslaved people's unpaid labor. And what we saw, even after the Civil War ended, even after the North won, at least won the war, Brian Stevenson argues that the South won the narrative. And I think that there are some good reasons to say that. But that we saw that because of this economic power, the South still was able to negotiate for things such as the Three-Fifths Compromise, wherein even though enslaved people, so the parents of Black children, the people who would advocate for Black children, weren't allowed to vote, their bodies counted when you were trying to decide a sort of voting power of different regions. And so what this did is that it gave the South outsized influence in national politics. And in 50 of the 72 years between Washington and Lincoln, the US had a slaveholder as president. And part of what has happened in the many years since is that some have questioned how big of a role slavery had in the Civil War and in the rebellion. And it's always useful to go back to the original sources when that happens, because there are all sorts of motivations for representing things one way or another. And so Alexander H. Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy. And even after he was part of trying to rebel against the country, he was elected to the US Senate, though he was not seated. He was elected and served as the US House Representative for Georgia, and then he was elected and served as the governor of Georgia. And I point this out because it's emblematic of the fact that there wasn't some great epiphany and understanding that this train of thought was a problem, or that what he had done was something that required him to be removed from public service. He was continued to be elected into office. And these are Alexander Stephens' words about why there was a need for the Confederacy and about the constitution of it. And so he said, the new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institutions, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. The prevailing ideas entertained by Jefferson and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with, but the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution would be evanescent and pass away. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. And I welcome you to think about this kind of thinking, this assertion that races are not equal, and that Black people, and that would include Black children, are not equal to white men, and how, or not equal to white children, and how that could play into well-documented phenomena like Black children not being protected, not being developed, not being treated in the same way by our institutions in society. And on the other side of this, of course, you have people who were fighting to end slavery and who articulated some of the impacts of it mentally. And this was a quotation by Frederick Douglass, who said, "I have observed this in my experience of slavery, that whenever my condition was improved, instead of its increasing my contentment, it only increased my desire to be free and set me to thinking of plans to gain my freedom. I have found that to make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and as far as possible, to annihilate the power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. He must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that only when he ceased to be a man." And as a child psychiatrist, when I read this quotation, it brought to mind the dynamic that is often created when a child is abused by a caregiver or by a parent. That when someone who is in a position of power, when someone, or better yet, an institution or structure or a country that is in a position of power, and they play a major role in your life and how you see yourself, when you're treated in a way that indicates you are less than, or that you are bad, or that you are undesirable, rather than being able to come up against that power, rather than understanding that the power is what is wrong, in order to survive, or in order to try to make sense of the world, that negative message about who and what you are is internalized. And so in this case, he's talking about someone who ceases to be a man. But I would say that when it comes to children, it can shape how they see their potential as women and as men in the broader society. So the Whitney Plantation is in Louisiana. And I think it's helpful to look at where we are now. One of the criticisms that may come up is that this is so long ago. Why are we focusing on this? And the reality is it's not so long ago because the ramifications of it are evident in every American institution, including those that shape the lives and the experiences of children. Mass incarceration continues to be a significant issue in Black communities and for Black families. And what we see is that in the Angola prison farm, which is called that because it was previously a plantation that included enslaved people from the part of Africa that is now called Angola, 80% of the prisoners there are Black men. And this has implications for children, for families, for communities, because these are people who are not able to play a role of breadwinner in their family, not able to provide backup for their partner in co-parenting, that aren't able to be another adult in the home that gives appropriate levels of supervision for children and adolescents, or for their protection. And so while there's often a discussion of mass incarceration, the ripple effects on families and on the children in those families is something that bears a lot of consideration as well. I ended up in New Orleans during Mardi Gras a few years back, and I was really struck by the segregation that was evident in the marching bands. Of course, you can't be 100% sure, but from the appearances of it, it looked as if every single band was either completely white or completely Black. And this was in the year around 2011 when I had this observation, so about 10 years ago. And at that time, which is many, many years after that Cornerstone speech, but fairly recent to us, the percentage of Black students in majority white schools was 23.2%, which was slightly lower than it was in 1968. So this issue of segregation, of fighting to get an education, of the education of Black students or Black children being treated differently than the education of white students, and being treated in a way where the messaging is that this is not for you, be that through dilapidated structures, outdated books, less funding per student, continues to persist. And infant mortality. So as I mentioned, there was a observance of Black children who died under the conditions of slavery at the Whitney plantation. And again, this is something where there continues to be a different infant mortality rate because of deliberate planning and the circumstances that planning brings Black children into. In Louisiana, the rate of infant mortality among non-Hispanic Black infants is more than double the rate of non-Hispanic white infants. So when we think about all of those years of unpaid labor, and then we think about policies like Social Security that left out people like domestic workers or people who worked on farms who, when those policies were started, were disproportionately Black. You set up a situation where Black families and the children in them don't have the same resources to begin with. Then that was superimposed with the results of redlining. And if you're not familiar with redlining, this is a brief video that helps explain it. And I welcome you as you watch this video to think about the implications for a developing child and what it means they're exposed to, both good and bad, and what opportunities they have, both good and bad, as a direct result of this policy, not as a direct result of the family's choice or of any individual trait about the child. And so I would encourage you, if you haven't read the 1619 Project or listened to the podcast, that it's a really digestible way of being aware of some of these issues. And the point is that it really doesn't require these issues of inequity and residential segregation and the downstream effects on schools and educational opportunities. It doesn't require anyone to have racism in their heart or ill will toward children, but it's something that is built into the way that the system operates and continues to. So as was mentioned, there are laws that say that this is not appropriate, but of course there's law and there's enforcement and implications of it. And we continue to see that segregation occurs. In most major cities, you can see that for yourself if you go neighborhood to neighborhood. And even when families aren't able to own property, there's also data showing that homes of Black people, when things are held evenly, are valued at less. And so you have where not being able to own has been something that's confounded wealth over time, but still has the devaluation of Black homes. There is messaging And there are very real implications of a country being told or being primed in this idea that a group of people, including the children that are in that group, do not matter, or that their lives do not matter. And of course, you do have the Black Lives Matter movement, but there still remains the question, do they? And why is there the need for such a statement in the first place? And what we see when we look at the numbers is that unarmed victims of police killings are more likely to be minorities. And you certainly have cases like those of Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice, where this impacted Black children specifically. And how is it that we continue to see this, that we know this is an issue in society, and yet we're not substantially moving the needle? And there are all sorts of associations of Black with bad or dirty or undesirable things or acts, where Black people are lightened in order to have them be more desirable. And that it's not just about aesthetics, it's also about attributes that are associated with Black children and with Black people. And this has implications for mental health. What we see is that when Black trauma isn't recognized or understood, that this narrative of Black people as angry can trickle into diagnoses that Black children are given. When the trauma of being a Black child in America, where people have to argue about whether your lives matter, isn't picked up by our diagnostic criteria or by our instruments, that sometimes that is mischaracterized as irritability or oppositionality. And so the diagnoses, if one is given, maybe ones that really focus on that irritability and anger. So diagnoses such as oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. And they don't, or they may not recognize mood symptoms or things that are the impacts of trauma. And this is because the mental health care system, mental health care professionals are part of the larger society. Unfortunately, they're not exempt from these messages that they receive and from the way that things are covered. So even when you look at white young people who have murdered others versus Black young people who have been killed, the white people who have committed murder are covered in a more sympathetic way than the Black young people who have been killed. And these children are growing up and operating in a society where sentencing outcomes for them, if they were to do something wrong, are worse. And for members of their family as well, lending to that family disruption that we saw back during the days of slavery and continue to see now. And that it's not even just about Black versus white, it's also about how dark-skinned somebody is. And that these images continue about what you can say, what is acceptable, how much you can speak up for yourself, and the consequences of your doing so. And so when we think about schools and educational policy, it's one where these children's lives, their educational experiences, and ultimately for many, their occupational opportunities are in the hands of people that may or may not understand or be invested in the Black child's educational process. The former US Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, was interviewed by Lesley Stahl in a national outlet. And this was after she had been appointed the Education Secretary. And that occurred after she had played a major role in shaping the public school system in the state of Michigan, despite the fact that she had never gone to the public school system and neither had any of her children. So Lesley Stahl asked, have the public schools in Michigan gotten better To which the US Secretary of Education replied, I don't know. Overall, I can't say that they have all gotten better. Leslie Stahl replied, the whole state is not doing well, to which the US Secretary of Education said, well, there are certainly pockets where the students are doing well. And Leslie Stahl said, no, but your argument that if you take funds away, that the schools will get better is not working in Michigan, where you had a huge impact and influence over the direction of the school system here. And the US Secretary of Education said, I hesitate to talk about all schools in general because schools are made up of individual students attending them. Leslie Stahl, the public schools here are doing worse than they did. The US Secretary of Education, Michigan schools need to do better. There is no doubt about it. Leslie Stahl, have you seen the really bad schools? Maybe try to figure out what they're doing. The US Secretary of Education, I have not intentionally visited schools that are underperforming. Leslie Stahl, maybe you should. The US Secretary of Education, maybe I should, yes. So I'd like to take you back to that comment at the original video that talked about deliberate planning. So this is someone who had a track record of failing Black students and was elevated to a national office in the educational realm after that. And when I say this track record, this isn't something that is subjective. It was quite clear and available to anybody who wanted to find out that the high school graduation rate after these reforms that former Secretary DeVos was instrumental in pushing through, the high school graduation rate for Black men in Detroit, Michigan, the most populous city in the state, was 23%. So less than 1 out of 4 Black men were graduating under this system that she was instrumental in planning before she was elevated to national office. And in this country, if you are a Black male who does not graduate from high school, your risk of go on to be part of the carceral system is 60%. And so what happens in schools and in communities, the redlining that sets this all up shapes not only the educational experience, but has an influence on how children see themselves, on the opportunities that are available to them, and what is real for them. James Baldwin said, if you're treated a certain kind of way, you become a certain kind of person. If things are described to you as being real, they're real for you, whether they're real or not.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll?
That one.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like?
And that one. That doll.
I play that clip for a few reasons. One is for the obvious impact of seeing children who are so young associate such negativity with a doll that looks like them, and that they have no difference between that and the other one besides the other one is white. So there's the impact on the children and what they think of the dolls. But it's not just about Black children, it's about white children and the messages that they receive, which are the same messages that lead those Black children to have those conclusions, but also about the adults who are receiving those same messages too, and have received those messages throughout their lives, including when they were children, adolescents, and adults. And I would welcome and encourage you to think about the way that those messages could shape the actions of decision makers and policymakers when they are making choices about the allocation of resources and about which kids are invested in and which kids are worthy of protection. We often say mental health when we're more focused on mental illness, particularly in the mental health care and medical fields. But I think it's always important to come back to what mental health actually looks like. And there's a definition from the World Health Organization that says it is a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. So there's so much about this definition that isn't about just the individual, but it's about what's happening to them in the form of those stresses of life. It's about the opportunities they have to realize their potential, to learn, to be employed, and the role that they play in the larger society. And all of those things have structural forces and influences that are shaping them. So we think about how this definition could apply to children. One could extrapolate it to youth who are able to develop healthy emotional, intellectual, and social functioning, explore, practice, and implement a growing repertoire of adaptive coping skills for handling difficult emotions and stressful situations, advance academically and occupationally to the best of their ability, and play a positive, developmentally appropriate role in their families and communities. And in keeping that definition in mind and considering the historical and social context, this brings us to the social theory of mental health, which simply acknowledges that social factors play an important role in the development and maintenance of mental wellness and in the development and maintenance of mental illness. And what we know is that those with more structural barriers, who face more isms or ways that they are marginalized, and who may also have poverty as a part of that picture, are at increased risk for mental illness. And this increased risk for mental illness is coupled with decreased access to services or control over environments of care, with mental health interventions, treatment, and services often being a relatively easy target for budget cuts. So now I'm going to take you to Atlanta, Georgia, where I've been practicing in one form or another for the past 10 years or so. And I'm going to take you to two zip codes. One is 30307, and the other is 30331. I have a private practice, a small private practice in 30307. And I've been seeing kids in public sector mental health settings in the 30331 neighborhood for about the past 8 years. And what we see is that in 30307, the family median income is $132,000. The family mean is $201,000. And just 5 or 6 miles away in 30331, family median is $47,000 and the family mean is $70,000. So there's quite a gap there in terms of what the families already have for resources as a unit, and that they can develop to their child's educational growth. When I have medical students that come to these different locations, at 30307, where the private practice is, I say there is street parking available and a number of nice restaurants and coffee shops within walking distance. Whereas in 30331, I say it's in a food desert, bring your own lunch. So just based on those numbers alone, you could probably quite accurately guess some information about the high schools that these zip codes are zoned for. The first, which has math and English proficiency scores of 16 and 9% respectively, which has 99% free lunch, which has the highest student-teacher ratio. The one that you may not get correct is which has a 73.4% graduation rate. Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade says, if you want to oppress people, you don't deny them school because they'll get educated. Instead, you school them. You take their children for 13 years and you create a system of passivity. Everything that comes out of that system is going to be a social mirror. So even though the graduation rate at Booker T. Washington High, which is the school that is zoned for the 30331, is 73.4%, which on the surface doesn't look bad. When you look deeper, what you find is that only 34.5% of their graduating students are college or career ready. And you compare this with college and career readiness at Druid Hills High, which is at 66.5%. So what this does is create students who are going into adulthood that are ill-equipped to change their family or their own situation socioeconomically. And it sets up a system where the extant inequities in income and earning potential are preserved, even if people, young people, children and adolescents, have done what we've told them they need to do, done what we've told them is the way out in terms of graduating from high school and staying as part of the so-called educational system.
There's this phrase that you might hear in the news sometimes, the school to prison pipeline. It's shorthand for how schools are funneling students, especially Black students, into the criminal justice system. It started in the 90s when schools responded to fears about crime with zero tolerance policies, which mandated suspensions and expulsions for certain violations. They also cracked down on little things like talking back or uniform violations. The hope was that it would keep bigger problems from bubbling up. But as a result, out-of-school suspensions have doubled since the 1970s, and they keep increasing, even though juvenile crime rates have now been dropping for years. Around the same time, the number of police officers stationed full-time inside schools has increased by a third between 1997 and 2007. Ostensibly, they were there to prevent mass school shootings like the one at Columbine, but they end up being a way for schools to basically outsource discipline to the police. Schools with officers have 5 times as many arrests for disorderly conduct as schools without them. Sometimes the results are shocking. But the less visible effect is that schools are feeding the racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Consider the fact that schools are more likely to have an officer on their campus if the student population is more than 50% Black. You might assume that that's because there's more crime at these schools, but although students at police schools are more likely to be arrested, they're not actually more likely to be charged in court for weapons, drugs, alcohol, or assault, at least according to one study. During the 2010-2011 school year, 1 in 6 public school students in the US were Black, but they accounted for 1 in 3 arrests at school. Same goes for other forms of school discipline. Black students are suspended or expelled 3 times more frequently than white students. It actually begins in preschool. 18% of preschoolers are Black. But if all preschoolers suspended more than once, 48% are Black. Studies show that differences in behavior can't fully account for these disparities. Black students and white students are sent to the principal's office at similar rates, but Black students are more likely to end up with a serious punishment. One study found that white students are more likely to be suspended for provable offenses like smoking or vandalism. Black students are more likely to be suspended for subjective offenses like talking back or insubordination. Students who are suspended in school are more likely to later drop out or get arrested. So the federal government is asking schools to make suspension and expulsion the absolute last resort. In Oakland, California, public schools are trying something called restorative justice, where both parties in a conflict talk it out with a counselor instead of relying on punishment. The results are pretty encouraging. In the last 10 years, chronic absenteeism is down and graduation rates are up in the schools that have tried it. Other cities and districts are also trying new policies. They're hoping that if their students end up in the criminal justice system, at least it won't be because the schools pushed them there.
And so not only are there situations where schools aren't doing their stated purpose of preparing students to enter the job market and to realize their potential, they're also potentially funneling them into a system that we know has its own traumas and mental health implications associated with it. These messages about who is worthy, who gets protected, who is inherently bad, make their way into the adultification of Black children, wherein both Black girls and Black boys are thought of as older, as less innocent, and as less in need of protection. And this can impact how they're treated by teachers or by people in positions of authority, and maybe even by people in their own community or in their own family. And how this can play out in the criminal justice system is that they may be more likely to be tried as adults. And we see that there is disproportionate impact of harsh penalties on Black youth. In a society where your symptoms are more likely to be attributed to willful badness, or maybe even inherent badness, rather than being understood as symptoms of mental illness or reactions to trauma, not having diagnoses, not having treatment, not having effective interventions has even greater implications across society systems. But because of those issues of poverty, insurance access, redlining, and the compounding effects over time, that access is something that can be more difficult for Black children and families to have. There's such a glut of learning disorders, intellectual disabilities, and mental health problems in the juvenile justice system that really good juvenile defenders have to have an understanding of these things. And there's a collaborator that I have at Emory School of Medicine who has defended largely Black children for years. And even though she has no formal mental health training, she can quite accurately look at someone's rap sheet and the things that have been said about them and extrapolate from that what diagnoses they may have because she sees it so frequently. These factors can have implications for the informed consent process and some of the candid conversations that have to be had with Black parents about navigating a society with untreated or undertreated mental health symptoms when you're in a situation that your children are unfairly, unjustifiably, simply given less room for error, and can inform the anticipatory guidance around things such as interactions with law enforcement and the right to remain silent, which is critically important for families, especially Black families, to be aware of. And so all of these issues are part of American structures or societal systems. And when families have less resources, when they have less learning opportunities, when they have members of the family that are removed because of mass incarceration, this is going to weaken the safety net and undermine that sense of safety and security that we know is really critical for development. As mentioned, there's overrepresentation in the criminal justice system at both the juvenile and the adult levels. And this has ripple effects in the community. And when we look at the hard numbers as it relates to poverty, we see that the federal poverty line is $26,500 for a family of 4, which, as you're well aware, in many cities, $30,000, $40,000, even $50,000 would not adequately meet their needs consistently. So that's an artificially low number, but even using that, 26%, roughly 1 out of 4 Black children live in poverty compared to 14% nationally. And poverty, because of the way it undermines that security and sense of safety, because of the implications it has for nurturance and food, because of its direct impact on developing brains, has been associated with numerous adverse mental health outcomes. And we have convergence of evidence from multiple sources that timing, duration, and intensity of poverty matter. And we do have data that shows that as income inequality worsens, as it has continued to do in this country, that mental health worsens as well. So coming back to the young man who said he was proud to make it to 21, even though he was in prison, he was one who was on all of those, who was on the side of those adverse determinants of mental health, where survival took preeminence. Aspiring for a future didn't quite make sense because he wasn't sure that he would have one. And he was part of systems that were chronically underfunded, including the school system, that despite him being identified as having a learning issue early on, did not meet those learning needs. I know that I've shared a lot of challenging, disturbing information today, but I want to make sure to point out that there is also the potential for people to achieve, for people to make contributions to society and realize potential, even in the face of adversity. And Ms. Simone Biles, the greatest of all time, based on publicly available information, has an ACE score of 5, but she's someone who was adopted by loving parents, who was encouraged, who had her ADHD appropriately treated, and who was able, most certainly, to make a contribution to the society and to the world. And so while you have these larger issues at play, there are also things that can be done that support access to care, that support adoption, or that buttress families and strength and those connections that children have to caregivers that can help people overcome. But it has to be done not because of grit or will on their part, but because of deliberate planning and setting them up to succeed. And so if you have expertise, whether that's medical or mental health, any position of privilege, and you may question if you do, but I encourage you to think about the power that you do hold. Often we can look up, but we don't necessarily look around. And your opportunities, for opportunities to be advocates for patients and for people in the various systems with which you interact. And taking action around these issues requires speaking up for conditions that support the healthy development of youth in all policies, being curious about the communities that the people you are serving, if you're in a service profession, are coming from, especially if that's a community that's different from your own. Screening and counting, so being intentional with your efforts, that it's not just about attending webinars or doing the IAT, but also having concrete numbers as your baseline and concrete numbers that you are continuing to look at to see if the efforts you're making are causing more equitable outcomes for the children and families that you serve. And this process is one that most certainly requires humility. And because of the multi-systemic nature of these problems, is going to require collaboration as well. And I'll end with a quotation by James Baldwin that said, "It is certain in any case that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. Children rely on the adults around them, on the systems around them to shape their lives. As an adult, you have power. I encourage you to continue to learn about these issues and to learn how you can leverage it so that you can be an agent of justice and not an enemy of it. Thank you.